Good morning. As folks start to file in here for part 2 of our SCORP webinar series, Sustainable Systems, Protecting and Adapting Our Resources. My name is Carol. I'm coming from the We Can Serve PA. We're very happy to be hosting this webinar series for our partners over at DCNR. I'd like to welcome today's speakers, DCNR Bureau of Forestry speakers Michael Hoffman, Chief Recreation Section, and Nate Reagle, ecologist. We have a special guest speaker with us today as well, Jeremy Wimpey, Ph.D., Applied Trails Research. Welcome to all of our speakers.
Thank you.
Michael, could you go ahead and advance the slide? Oh, thank you very much. So for those of us who are not familiar with Zoom yet, as most of us probably are, here's a sneak peek of your Zoom meeting toolbar. You can control your audio here and your video. You can click to see who's in the room by clicking on participants, and you can chat with the session hosts, panelists, or each other by using the chat function. This is also how we're going to be handling questions today. So as you think of questions for our speakers, please use the chat function and type them in. I'll be coordinating everything here on the back end. And at the end of the session, we will handle all questions. There's been some questions about how we change our view. If you would like to see only the person speaking at the moment, you would click up here in the right and make sure you have speaker view selected. If you'd like to see all panelists at once, make sure that you have gallery view selected. This is just a little sneak peek of what it'll look like when you have only speaker view selected. And again, please utilize the chat box to type in all of your questions as you think of them. I will be monitoring the chat in the background and will bring all questions to our speakers at the end. All phones and audio has been muted. So if you do need to speak at the end during the question and answer period, please remember to unmute yourself. And now without further ado, I will pass the baton over to Michael Hoffman.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carol. Thanks for the transition. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the State Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan chapter on sustainable systems. So I wanted to just first go over a little overview about the rec plan itself. It starts off with an overarching vision, which is that enjoyable outdoor recreation is welcoming to all and accessible to every Pennsylvania community. And I think this gets at the fact that recreation means something different to a lot of different people, depending on what your background is and what your uses and expectations are of a space. There's different opportunities for everybody. And so this plan takes great ends to try to consider that whole space holistically for the benefit of all Pennsylvanians. There were 5 priorities that were identified in the plan. Recreation for all being one of them, also health and wellness, and technology. And then the one that we're here to talk about today is the sustainable systems priority. And there were different action steps that were associated with those. And we're going to talk about that as we get into the presentation here just a little bit. So overall, underneath those 5 priorities, there were a total of 20 recommendations that the plan sets forth. And accompanying those 20 recommendations are 70 specific actions that the plan outlays in order to achieve this overarching vision of sustainable, enjoyable outdoor recreation for all Pennsylvanians. You can discover the plan at a couple different places that you can see here on your screen. Hopefully, there's some links there. First and foremost, the DCNR Outdoor Recreation Plan webpage. There on the DCNR website, there's a story map overview available at this link, maps.dcnr.pa.gov. And then, of course, the the paper copy. If you'd like to receive a paper copy of this plan, great team effort, a lot of good things in there. Please email Lori Ross at LOROSS@pa.gov, and we'll be sure to get you a copy of this latest edition of the plan. Right, so like I said earlier about the 5 priority areas that are in the plan, you can see those here on your screen. They are health and wellness, recreation for all, sustainable systems, which is of course the webinar that we're here to talk about today, funding and economic development, may have missed that in the list earlier, and technology. As you can see, we've already hosted webinars for those first 2. Sustainable systems, of course, is today, and the dates for funding and economic development and technology, respectively. You can see those on your screen. Please feel free to attend if those topics interest you. So sustainability is a really important word, I think. Certainly a word seems like we're hearing more and more about these days. I hate to think that it's crossed over into the buzzword or jargon category, because to me it doesn't. I think it's very important, and it's something that as a land manager or even a recreator, everyone I think needs to consider total sustainability of a system, especially when we're talking about recreation. And so just to offer a definition, sustainability refers to how social, economic, and environmental systems function in a way in which a system can continue in perpetuity without irreplaceable harm to any one system. And so to kind of break that down, what we think about sustainable recreation is that a sustainable recreation system is one that balances visitor objectives, managerial capacity, and ecological capacity. There's visitor objectives, management, and the environment. And kind of at the nexus of those 3 things is a sustainable system. And I think that's really important. And there's kind of a traditional paradigm that if you build it, they will come. And the reality is that people need space in which to recreate, and they need facilities by which to access that space and enjoy the outdoors. And it might be a thought that, well, if those things are just all provided, then then everyone will enjoy it in perpetuity. But there's oftentimes the ability to manage those facilities sustainably by having adequate staffing and adequate resources to continue those facilities into the future. Maybe often gets overlooked. And so, things degrade over time, at least by universal weathering. And then when you also account for just wear and tear by users and by climate change related events and just a whole host of other things, these facilities require periodic maintenance. And so having that committed at the front end of authoring a recreation system is highly important. And then the ecological capacity is, of course, of paramount importance. I mean, historical tales, too numerous to mention on this webinar, describe the deleterious effects of what happens when the environmental capacity is breached, and what harm that inflicts on whatever creatures are occupying space, human beings included. And the reality is that when it comes to outdoor recreation, people are drawn to these spaces because of the health benefits that they provide and the aesthetic qualities, the fresh air, the beautiful green spaces, water, all these things. And so it's really of the utmost importance that these values of the environment are preserved, or at least conserved in perpetuity, because if they become degraded over time, then in reality the entire recreation experience gets degraded along with that. So it's a very important part of sustainable management. And then of course the visitor objectives, like I mentioned at the beginning, ultimately, when we're talking about recreation, these things exist for the benefit of people. And so, considering stakeholders and the different users of the recreation system, whatever it is, and striving to meet those expectations, though they may change over time, is of great importance. And also realizing that some uses of a recreation system may conflict with other uses. And so it becomes incumbent upon land managers to consider, all the uses in totality and to try to deconflict those things as much as possible. Sustainability challenges. So, what you see here are some numbers, that you can read on the screen yourselves, but just looking at the total number of outdoor spaces across the Commonwealth, many state parks and state forests, millions of acres of public land that have been conserved here, and over 12,000 miles of trails. So trails would fall into that facilities category that I mentioned earlier. The ways, the physical things by which people access the recreation systems. 12,000 miles of trails and 1,700 miles of rail trails that exist in these conserved outdoor spaces. So all that to say, Pennsylvania is really very, very rich and steep in conservation history, which these days means a really relatively large land base that is often available for recreation. And what a great thing that is for Pennsylvania. So when we went out on this stakeholder engagement process for this version of the SCORP, we heard a lot back from the public. I think it was, Diane would know the number off the top of her head probably, but I think it was some 8,000 comments or something like that we got back over a series of public polls and specific questionnaires, sample-based approaches, things like that. And you can read the facts on your screen right now. But what we heard back overwhelmingly was that recreation is really, really important to people. And it's an important part of the Pennsylvania culture. You can see on that first block, 9 out of 10 Pennsylvanians participated in at least some recreational activity. Most people think that it would be a wise move for the Commonwealth to increase its holdings of publicly available land for recreation. An overwhelming majority indicates that it's important for the government to invest in sustainable practices. And this is also a really important economic driver for the state too, generating millions of dollars annually in consumer spending. Overall, it's a really important value for Pennsylvanians. And so, and there were a couple questions here that I just wanted to point out from the survey. One of which, what is the single most important thing that parks and outdoor providers can do to help them participate in outdoor recreation in the state? You can see the answers here on your screen: clean restrooms, more trash and recycling receptacles, avoid creating new facilities until the current maintenance needs are met. And then a strong suggestion for more partnerships, organized cleanup, and cost-effective management solution. So, really looking at this slide holistically is kind of getting at that managerial dimension of overall sustainability, which is very important. The public shared concern about climate change. Remember that deleterious weathering effect on facilities and just overall human health. More than half of the public survey respondents and nearly 2/3 between the ages of 18 and 34 very concerned about this. So, I mean, this is also a very important public dimension for consideration here as we're talking about overall sustainability. Over 60% of the recreation providers said that maintaining the existing local parks is a significant or major challenge. And that's a pretty significant jump from the last time we did this over 5 years ago, from 46% in 2014 to 60% nowadays. So, you know, people are starting to realize that it's not just as simple as if you build it, they will come. You know, it's build and maintain in perpetuity. So, you know, imparting this long range visionary approach to management is something that seems to be catching on. You know, which, you know, as land managers, you know, this is really good news for the most part. You know, again, from the polls, priorities for the funding efforts. A lot of information on this slide with the graph. But the, you know, again, just kind of telling that same story. So what you see here, the individually colored bars are the results of different surveys. The local park and recreation provider survey, the public land survey, and the spring 2019 Lion poll. And then the lines proceeding off to the right are the percentage of responses from the participants. And kind of what this tells me, if you look at, you know, the first 5 or whatever, the first one especially is a pretty stark comparison to others, but just that maintaining existing park and recreation areas is of the utmost importance. Acquiring and protecting that open space, so having that physical setting in which to recreate, and which I would say is inclusive of probably the next one, which is protecting the wildlife and the fish habitat, and just kind of getting at that overall healthy ecosystem, which is really what draws people to the space to begin with. You know, all this is of very high importance to our constituents. So that's great. A lot of some really great upfront material there, but then to drill down into the plan itself, you know, one of the priorities that we mentioned, which is the topic for today, is this sustainable systems priority, and there were 5 recommendations there, and I'm just gonna kind of give a brief overview of what those recommendations are, and you know, how we think about them. And then afterwards, I will turn it over to our next presenter, Jeremy Wimpey, to talk about sustainable trail systems specifically. And if you're not already doing so, please feel free to type any questions that you might have into the comment box, and we can address those at the end and have whatever discussion we need to at the end. So the first recommendation from this score plan for the priority sustainable systems is to assess the infrastructure that we already have and what those maintenance needs are. So, you know, like we said, a lot of the, you know, the trails and outdoor recreation facilities that we have across our landscape is, you know, in the process of weathering, just like everything else. At some places more intensely than others, and at some places with more harmful effects to the environment than others, and in some places meeting the needs of the local stakeholders, or not so much as others. And so, you know, what you can see here in the picture is a section of trail in our Michaud State Forest where we have a stream crossing, and you might not know it by looking at it, but this is a very small tributary to a very high quality watershed, the Mountain Creek system, and just the way the trail was designed, which I believe was very informally and laid out very informally. You know, this type of stream crossing just bears you know, some kind of deleterious effects, you know, on that watershed. And you know, certainly as climate change becomes more of an issue and we experience more flooding effects from you know, prolonged seasonal rains and everything, I mean, this this type of facility is probably bordering on the crossing over into that unsustainable realm and in need of improvement. Recommendation number 2, to protect and conserve the lands and waters, considering the impacts of climate change on outdoor recreation. Again, climate change is, by all scientific accounts, a very, very threatening ecological phenomenon to all systems, including outdoor recreation systems. And so we need to get out ahead of that and make preparations for increased flooding events from longer and more intense rains, increased usage from a prolonged recreation season, things like that. And if you're interested, those kinds of there's a whole separate plan, DCNR, climate change adaptation and mitigation plan, which is also available on the DCNR website. When I'm finished presenting, I can put that link into the comment box too, if that would be something that would be interest to anybody. Recommendation 3, fostering stewardship for Pennsylvania's recreation areas and natural, cultural, and historic resources. So, under the Pennsylvania State Constitution, the Commonwealth is a trustee of the environmental, historic, and aesthetic resources of the environment. And so it's incumbent upon land managers to manage those resources in a public trust, not only with the generation of today, but also those yet to come. And so we do have these valuable historic resources and the natural and aesthetic qualities of the environment. And so taking into account robust stakeholder engagement to gauge public opinion and expectation of the recreation systems is of the utmost importance. And then again, realizing that those things may conflict at sometimes, and at that point relying on our planning processes. Recommendation 4, designing outdoor recreation areas to minimize impacts on the environment or conflicts among user groups. I guess that's a good segue from what I was just talking about with the conflicts among user groups. But this is really leaning on our planning processes to consider all the factors in a space that we would be dealing with at one particular instance. Ecological factors, the type of soils, slope and aspect of the topography, the presence or absence of rare, threatened, endangered plants, and other protected areas, whether they be ecologically sensitive or required protection under the statutes, and then looking at the options that we have in the toolbox to properly design, construct, implement, and maintain recreational facilities in perpetuity. Right, so this is getting to be the end of my talk, but as far as helping to implement the plan and ideas to support your DCNR funding requests under this iteration of the SCORP, a lot of things kind of surface, and what you see here on the screen are just a couple ideas, but there's, certainly more. But you can see from just the way we're thinking about sustainable systems, the importance of planting native trees at playgrounds, the role of native vegetation in our Pennsylvania ecosystems really can't be understated. Sustainable trails. Secondly, a lot of poorly planned trails are kind of here today, gone tomorrow, and as user groups and expectations shift around, and in the process they can confuse other users and also provide deleterious effects to the ecosystem, and also when not not planned sustainably and implemented sustainably can really be more costly in the long run, than what might be thought of at the very beginning. But moving right along, again, paying this mind to climate change and increasing the resilience of infrastructure to the effects caused by climate change, conserving more open lands for recreation. So just building up that space in which people can enjoy the outdoors and all the healthful benefits that they can provide. And finally, protecting Pennsylvania's natural heritage. We're really blessed in this state with an exceptional array of biological diversity and all types of different ecosystems. Actually, a fact I didn't even realize until I started working for DCNR was that we, second only to Alaska in the United States, Pennsylvania has the most miles of stream of any state in the nation, second only to Alaska. So, wonderful and very, very important and constitutionally protected set of ecosystem services that we have custodial responsibility for, and that are potentially available for enjoyment by all Pennsylvanians. And so at this point, that takes me to the end of my presentation. If there's any questions for me, please type them into the comment box. I can address those the best I can at the end. And at this point, I'm going to shift control over to Jeremy, who can talk about sustainable trails. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Michael. It was a fantastic introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. My name is Jeremy Wimpey. I'm a adjunct research faculty at Virginia Tech as well as Penn State in the Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation program at Virginia Tech, and in the Recreation Park Tourism Management program at Penn State, as well as the proprietor of Applied Trails Research. In my university roles, I'm trained as a geographer and spend my time focusing on trails and looking at sustainability of trails and working to kind of protect those, as Michael said, in perpetuity for enjoyment. We're going to focus today on sustainable trail systems, recognizing that most public land access and activities on public lands utilize trails as a backbone of their recreational experience. Certainly a lot of the front country facilities as well. And I was pleased to hear Michael refer to trails as facilities. I think that's the first step in embracing them as a sustainable piece of recreation infrastructure. But trailheads, restrooms, park infrastructure, et cetera, is all very important as well. But today, we'll focus on these trails. My expertise is mostly in natural surface trails. And we're going to talk through kind of this outline here, a little bit of research background about kind of where we take a science-based approach in the university setting, where we're moving in the research field to try and better understand sustainability, recognizing the dynamics of use and climate and forest and public land management. We'll talk through that, how that informs a sustainability approach. I'm going to talk through one that we've been using for about the last decade with a lot of these federal land managers that you see here on this slide to inventory and assess trails and their sustainability. It'll tie very nicely into what Michael presented in terms of, I think he had 3 spheres of sustainability: ecological, economic, and social. We split one of those out into a 4th sphere, but we'll tie that together. And then I want to go through spend a little bit of time looking at applications of this in the context of developing, maintaining, and managing sustainable trail systems. I hope that you'll see ways to, apply this beyond the natural surface context into the greenway and sealed surface as well. And then finally, we'll conclude with some time for questions. And again, as Michael and Carol noted, feel free to type those questions in the chat box and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. So, there we go. So jumping straight into that research background, these are 2 graduate students you see on the slide, 2 graduate students at Virginia Tech in the forestry program, Johanna Arredondo in the foreground and Fletcher Miadama in the background. This was work they were doing on the Appalachian Trail, and working to further our knowledge of sustainability of trails. So we've long known the impacts of trail use and water on erosion on trails. These folks, as well as others, are really the current research focus is geographically scaling out and looking at things at watershed or landscape level. As Michael mentioned, some of those bridges in some of his photos in the Michaud State Forest, looking at that kind of that watershed approach to sustainability and what are the either point source or linear impacts associated with trails on that watershed. And to do that, we're using a lot of these tools. Some of you may have some familiarity with LiDAR, which is laser scans of the Earth's surface. They yield high resolution terrain models that we can do these hydrologic and other surface analyses from to better understand the context of the trail and the landscape. We're using mobile tools, as you see Fletcher's entering data there, I think into an iPad in that photo, but we're using mobile tools to collect our data, helps us with efficiency, as well as some sensors that are on those that can help us geolocate those, as well as, slide advanced here, collect particular data on each set. And this research has led to some recent advances using these terrain models and in the assessment and design and planning context, has led to several recent advances in our understanding of characteristics of the landscape at the watershed scale that impact physical, social, managerial sustainability. We've developed some tools on the Michaud State Forest as well as the Rothrock State Forest, and working with some of the folks out of Harrisburg in the geospatial space to create some tools to do digital analysis and overview of trail sustainability. And our focus really has been on things like trail tread watersheds, which are looking at micro watersheds that are defined by water control features along the trail, as well as landscape level watershed or other conservation boundaries, wilderness areas, for example, at the federal scale, or other active forestry management plots. And then leveraging appropriate technologies, not just for data collection, but also new technologies. UAVs or drones were kind of a big natural resource research tool over the last 20 years. We're starting to see those in the trail space for collecting data on trails and monitoring and assessing those. We also seek to kind of integrate across disciplines. Folks here in the photos, we've got Jeff Marion, who is my advisor at Virginia Tech, a USGS scientist that really focused on natural resource impacts of trails. In the middle there is Dr. Bob Manning, retired from University of Vermont, kind of one of the pillars of social science management that really focused on crowding and conflict and visitor experience in the park and public land setting. And then managerial there, we've got the Yogi Bear Ranger as an illustration there, just recognizing that we need to integrate across these contexts. We can't just look at erosion and natural resources or just look at experience. We need to put that back into the full context of what it takes to manage these places. And I would say that this is relatively new, probably in the last 10 years, this has been gaining more and more traction. And the place that we're combining these is in integrative studies, of course, but also using GIS and other computing advances to help us pair data from a visitor use study with a rec ecology study. And again, leveraging those high resolution terrain models and improved technologies and more compact and smaller technologies and longer battery life to do this efficiently. So with sustainable trail design, Michael mentioned, when trails are designed or built, you will get recreationists. They will come along. This is a trail in Cuyuna, Minnesota that was built in the late 2000s, early 2010 type time period. It's an example of an extremely sustainable, physically and environmentally sustainable trail. It manages water well. It keeps users on the trail. What else? There's a lot of stuff that goes into making that function. And in the past 10 years since this trail was built, we've seen new technologies advance on both the users, in this case mountain bikers, on this trail system, with the advent of new technologies and new trends and new tastes within the user community, but also things like e-bicycles, e-mountain bikes that have come along and really shaped the landscape in northern Minnesota, to where they're recognizing that while these trails were very sustainable when they were designed, they are in a dynamic situation in terms of the resources that are available to take care of them, as well as the use pressures and desires. And they're responding to that currently with some new trail development in that area. And so we'll go back to kind of why is this important? Again, trails are the backbone for most of our recreational activities on our public lands. A lot of trails, and we'll see an example here from the Michaud State Forest that Michael alluded to. You know, a lot of trails are put on the ground with very little planning or oversight or design process. Especially in our federal public lands, the Forest Service manages 160,000 miles of trail roughly, and you know, over 2/3 of that was just adopted older trail systems, things we like to call legacy trails, either old skid routes from resource extraction or resource protection, or past transportation routes through the forest, animal game routes as well, that were adopted as trails, and as such weren't designed, constructed, and managed as kind of long-term sustainable trails. So we're seeing folks shift and try and relocate or redevelop those legacy trails often. And as I mentioned on the last slide, we're seeing changes in the tastes and trends of the trail users. And too often, and more often than not in the past, we've seen that the desired trail experience, as well as the managing to reduce the potential for conflict, as was laid out in priority 4 there, was left out of this process until more recently. So with kind of that background, we have an approach that we use to classify trail sustainability, recognizing that the past focus has been primarily on physical sustainability, or how do we make the trail handle the use that's intended to be on it, given the soils that are present and the landscape, the watersheds that are present. How do we build a trail that's kind of robust and stays in place? The users can use it, the water will shed off of it. And there's lots of great examples from the Forest Service, the Appalachian Mountain Club, and many other state level resources that can help with this. The IMBA Trail Solutions book from the early 2000s has a lot of great diagrams on how to kind of address physical sustainability. And while these are crucial, they lack the social managerial context. So we tend to view sustainability as a multi-legged stool here, 4 legs in this case. And I believe we're splitting the 3 that Michael talked about. We put physical and ecological into that environmental sustainability that the Ph.D. DCNR presented earlier. But we look at these 4 categories of sustainability, and we recognize that sustainability is not a black and white yes or no situation. We can have trails that are less than physically sustainable, or have a use that's on them that exceeds the ability to withstand erosion. We can make up for that with additional managerial inputs, or perhaps it's meeting a need or a desire for experience that we can't meet otherwise. So we talk about how we can balance this. It's kind of a balancing act in the face of dynamicism, which requires some planning. So I'm going to go through these 4 contexts and talk about how we put those together and think about that balancing act over time. Ecological sustainability, as Michael alluded to, this is really how do we place trails onto the landscape in a way that they work with the desired management of that landscape, frankly. And if we're doing forestry management or watershed management, how are we making sure that our trail is located and that it's functioning on that landscape in a way that complements the desired ecological conditions? If there's sensitive resources, how do we avoid those? If there's a long-term plan for forestry management activities, how do we make sure that the recreational experience and the forestry management objectives are met simultaneously? And this is a great example in this photo. This is in North Georgia, an old legacy trail. This is an old roadway that was adopted as a trail. It's now an official Forest Service trail, and it provides access to this stream. The gentleman is fly fishing in the stream, something that's familiar probably to a lot of Pennsylvanians. We can see that the ecological sustainability of this trail is actually pretty low. We've got a muddy trail with water flowing down. The user experience is pretty low quality. The fishermen and the wader probably don't care too much about the muddiness, but they're carrying mud and sediment directly into that water resource, which they actually rely on having high quality water for their recreation activity to support that trout population. So we do look at this during the level of trail redevelopment or trail construction as well, recognizing that that's when a lot of our kind of ecological impacts may occur. And if we do things well and we plan well, over the life of the trail, the maintenance and the use impacts are low and durable and long-term sustainable. When we look at physical sustainability, again, this fits into kind of that environmental space along with the last one that Michael spoke to, but this is kind of the core, what we've talked about the focus being on in the past. Do we have a physically robust trail tread? Does it stay in place year to year? Does it shed water the way that we want it to, often and frequent enough that it's not causing erosion along the trail or erosion below the trail? And then is the tread durable to the use? If we have a motorized use or an equestrian use or some sort of high level of use that's causing more erosion to the trail, do we need to augment or do we have the soils present that can hold up to that? And if so, what are the grades that are acceptable in that sustainability realm? We can mitigate a lot of physical sustainability with these augmentations. As you see here, there's some rock armor across this seasonal drainage to allow folks to ride across that and it not become a muddy mess like we saw in the photo from the show there with the corduroy, the sticks that were placed in a muddy crossing. So there are ways to do this during the construction phase or in the maintenance phase to address this, and you can end up exceeding kind of rule of thumb guidance for trail alignment or steepness if you have the resources to put into augmenting the trail tread. Social sustainability gets quite a bit more complex. My colleagues at Penn State in the Recreation Park Tourism Management Program, they focus mostly on this social science and social sustainability realm. Bob Manning as well, that we saw a photo of earlier, dedicated his whole career to really understanding crowding and conflict in park settings. Along trails, we're talking about whether or not the trail system meets the needs and desires of the users. We often, you can see this on Google reviews, you can see it in feedback forms that you all collect. But you can also see it, folks will vote with their feet or with their hooves or their tires. If your trail system isn't meeting the needs of folks and you're seeing a lot of social trails, you need to think critically about the experience and the access that your trail system is providing on your landscape and work to if you're going to redevelop a trail system, work to address those desires for access and experience. When done well, social sustainability, and there's ties between all of these realms, but social sustainability in particular helps connect our user base with our managers. It can help foster that stewardship goal and help increase stewardship on trails and associated with trail systems and outdoor rec. When it's done well, it's an opportunity for the land manager and the users to come together. And when designed well, trails can help to mitigate conflicts. The last part of this that we really focus on in an inventory and assessment phase is really making sure that we have trails on the ground that make sense and that they're easily navigable. Lots of times we go to trail systems that have, less signage than others, and they seem to make sense is kind of the best way to think about it. You get out on the trail system, you can navigate it kind of with an innate sense of the landscape and the interpretation of it. Other trail systems we're out on have an excessive number of signs, both regulatory and otherwise. And we'll look at those. Often the ones that have more signs are the ones that are harder to navigate, and the signs are kind of like a Band-Aid, a treatment for the symptom. So that's another context we look at in social. And then finally, we look at managerial sustainability. And this looks beyond just the folks in the uniform. Often we look at budgets, federal budgets in particular. Public lands budgets can be slow to increase, if not constantly decreasing. We see a lot of vacancies in the federal agency staff in the trail space currently, and they've always struggled to kind of maintain their trails. So in this context, we recognize that that's kind of where we are now and for the foreseeable future. So we look at how do we attract and train and organize with folks not in uniform. So where do our volunteers come from, and how do they become part of our stewardship and our maintenance and managerial space? Are these folks that can help us with inspection and condition assessments and help us do risk management? If so, what knowledge and what skills and what tools do they need to be working in? And how do we communicate with them as well? So if there's some places we work, we do wet weather or seasonal closures on trails, and try and plug these folks in. So as I said, there's a lot of connections between these three realms, or four realms, sorry. And the linkages can be used to your advantage when done well, and they can undercut yourself as well when not done well. I want to talk a little bit about some applications of this in the development, management, and maintenance phases. And some of the ways we do that are through applications of technology. We can't be out on all of our trails counting folks, so we often go to these different apps that you see here. Strava's another, and try and use those to help us understand use patterns or use levels. In some cases, we're informing permits and quotas, as we'll see on the Pacific Crest Trail in a few slides. In other cases, we're monitoring trail system development, as we'll see on the Michaud State Forest. And we've seen these used to augment LEO activities and to help inform resource protection and experience management in the past with our public lands partners. In Strava, this is, if folks aren't familiar with this, this is an app that folks can use on their phone, or they can take a GPS track off of a small device and upload it to their phone, documenting where their use was. It's most popular with trail runners and mountain bikers. On the Michaud State Forest in 2014 through 16, through Penn State, we were working to support an inventory and assessment of the north portion of the state forest. We were able to use this data to document this rogue trail, informal trail network, as well as look at relative levels of use on the official trails and the informal trails. The Michaud has about 120 miles of formal trails on this portion of the forest, and we found close to that many miles of informal trails. This is just a snapshot of what they call their heat map product in 2014 on the left, 2015 on the right. We're continuing to use this data. Michael's working with some folks out of Shippensburg University to continue to use this Strava data to document the changes in use, as well as the development and redevelopment of these visitor created trails on this portion of the forest. And I believe they're tying that back to some watershed level management to help mitigate impacts from climate change to this watershed and the Mountain Creek watershed, as he mentioned. Another place we're using technology is to inform our assessment products. So we can catalog that use level and document, quantify the use level. But as we put together these plans, the last thing we want is a plan that sits on a shelf. That's usually, we've done our work, we've done inventory and assessment, we've come up with a redevelopment plan working with the managers. And if that thing sits on the shelf, we've all really failed to work together properly. The process and the outputs from this should become a common knowledge base for the managers and the partners in that stewardship space, to both recognize and identify the current strengths and weaknesses of a trail system, but also to guide them in how to do redevelopment and how to work together to go through permitting and implementation plans to address these and create a sustainable network in the future, recognizing that too will be dynamic. Just like your SCORPs are redone every 5 years, there is a need to revisit these things occasionally. And when these are done really well, we do see them become sales and marketing tools. Friends groups can pop up. Private and public donations and grants can be pulled together to implement this. The plan we're looking at here from the Chattahoochee National Forest was completed in 2012. And I think so far they've done about 20 different contracted projects out of that, as well as numerous couple dozen stewardship-led projects across that forest to implement the redevelopment plan. And I'm gonna just show real quickly how we use some use. This is survey data that we've used to look at PCT volumes of use across the Pacific Crest Trail, National Scenic Trail running from Canada to Mexico along the spine of California Sierra Mountains. These are 4 years of data. You can kind of see these green clouds, and I'm gonna overlay some arrows here. We're looking north to south on the y-axis and March through October on the x-axis. The red arrow showing the traditional northbound through hikers, similar to the Appalachian Trail. It goes through y'all's state. That's the traditional direction of travel. With some regulatory permitting, they only allow 50 starts northbound per year or per day early in the use season. We saw some shifts, and you can see in this blue arrow a southbound slug of traffic that starts later in the year when the snow's melted out of the mountains up in the north, going from about June to October. We've leveraged this information with the Pacific Crest Trail managed by the U.S. Forest Service and their partner, the NGO, Pacific Crest Trail Association, an analog to your ATC, to look at specific mileage along the trail. We're seeing here in the Central Sierra, if any of y'all have hiked the JMT or been to Yosemite or Sequoia Kings National Parks, this is that area, and we're looking at 4 years of data. The first year, 2016, shown in green, you can see that was kind of our peak highest use. They made these regulatory changes and these permit changes, and they've been able to draw down that peak use and flatten that curve, which has helped integrate wilderness management through the Sierra. But you'll see in the gray, we have that uptick in September. And so you can kind of see we've really just played like squeeze the toothpaste tube with use and push them out to a fall use level. But this is some of the information we're leveraging from surveys and then modeling of use to help these folks better understand that social component and work on wilderness and capacity and crowding in that space. So last slide before we go to questions here, if you want to start thinking about typing some of those into the chat panel. But we look at the Central Sierra region, which was shown in that last plot in terms of its use. There's 7 federal land managing agencies there. About 95% of the PCT corridor through there is in federally designated wilderness, 1964 Wilderness Act wilderness. And these diagrams don't need to take too much home from these other than that each circle is unique. Each circle represents one of these federal land managing agencies and their permit system related to wilderness management and how they interact with each other on the landscape. So we were able to document these differences for them. And we have a meeting next week. Actually, we have 2 meetings a year with them where we're working to better integrate these permit systems and try and deal with that squishy toothpaste tube of use to help them address sustainable recreation on their corridor. So with that, I'm going to pause and open us up for questions and dialogues. I hope that that kind of high level overview of the realms of sustainability and thinking about trails as the backbone of our outdoor recreation is useful. You know, I think one of the important things is to recognize that this is a dynamic space and it's very much a planning place. So you need to have an inventory and assessment of what you have on the ground. You need to be forward thinking with your partners and within your agency to better understand the impacts of climate change, future management plans, et cetera. And then keep revisiting through monitoring.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And as we're waiting for folks to type their questions into the webinar chat function, I will open the floor to the other panelists. Do you have questions for each other? All right, something just came through from BK Kohler. What is a great resource to use as an example for maintenance techniques and training?
I'll start, and Michael or Nathan, if you have some DCNR specific ones, please feel free to add those in. I think I showed on one of the early slides, the Professional Trail Builders Association is a trade organization that supports the trail industry on kind of the construction and maintenance side. They are currently working with the U.S. Forest Service and with American Trails on some certificates and training curricula. So that should be a resource that's coming online soon. In the meantime, the American Trails organization, I think I'll try and find their website and put it in the chat here soon, but they have a link to what they call the National Trails Training Partnership, which is NTTP, which is a kind of a clearinghouse calendar of trail training events. So in terms of hands-on training, those are 2 good resources and connections to look for through that network. Another place is the International Mountain Bike Association. Their book is called Trail Solutions, and that is a good kind of fundamentals of trail sustainability, both for maintenance and construction. It's a great textbook reference. We use it with a lot of our students. And while it's mountain bike focused, it does have the water management strategies are some of the best. And I think it applies broader than just mountain bike trails as well.
Michael or Nate, do you have any follow-up?
Yeah, I was struggling with my mute button there. Sorry. Yeah, I think Jeremy hit on 3 of the big ones I was going to touch on. So thank you for sharing that. And then, yeah, you know, I think it depends on your goals and the type of use that you're expecting. For the non-motorized ones, I think the ones Jeremy referenced are fantastic. And I would just add on to that for motorized trails, the Great Trails Manual, which is published by National Off-Highway Vehicle Association, is probably the standard for sustainable motorized trails.
And Michael, would you be able to share a link to that resource?
I believe I could. I'm not aware of an online version, but I can look for it. Or I believe I have an electronic one. If I could be in touch with whoever asked the question.
Okay, well, on that note, if you guys are willing and able to type your email addresses into the chat box so folks can ask their questions after the event today as well, that would be great. We do have some more questions coming in. Do you have any suggestions on recruiting and training trail volunteers? And that's open to any of our panelists.
Just to start us there again, Michael, I think one of the places we always look to turn to is our organized user communities. And if we don't have organized user communities working to develop some sort of organization there, that the Chattahoochee-Oconee report that I alluded to or showed a picture of the cover page from, that was a group that formed about a year before we did that assessment. The Forest Service worked closely with all of their recreational user group partners. They had Appalachian Trail clubs, they had horse and equestrian user clubs, motorized and non-motorized, mountain bike, hiking, wilderness, etc. They kind of had this gamut of user communities across that forest that they engaged with. They recognized the need to create something called co-trails. And co-trails was an umbrella for all those organizations to come together and be kind of a conduit or a single point of contact for the forest. Other projects we've seen, highly successful forests working with local clubs and communities. We're working on a 90-mile trail development on the Wayne National Forest right now. Started with just the Athens Bicycle Club, which is a mountain bike community. A new group formed called the Trail Sisters, which is a women's only trail running and trail enthusiast group. And they're bringing in the local community as well. So a lot of times during the redevelopment process and the inventory and assessment process, you can identify a lot of those resources. I know 2 forests in Pennsylvania, the Friends of Rothrock recently formed through around the same time as one of these inventory and assessment projects, and the Friends of the Michaud as well. And I think those are unique. And Michael may be able to speak more about how those are progressing, but that's where we often try and develop our stewardship partnerships.
Yeah, and just to build on that from the DCNR side of things. So conservation volunteers, that's for both state parks and state forests, and you begin there with your local park or state forest district, and they would recruit volunteers based on the forest or park priorities. And Jeremy mentioned Friends Group, and again, all these kind of start at that local level and work with the forest district priorities. I would imagine for state parks it's quite similar. And then the Pennsylvania outdoor crew for youth is another great avenue for getting involved at the volunteer level with us.
Great, thank you. This is a question for our DCNR panelists. Does DCNR utilize a standard trail assessment protocol?
Yes, so well, it's important to remember for DCNR, there's the Bureau of State Parks and the Bureau of Forestry. And I can say for the Bureau of Forestry, we do have a trail assessment process, and like Jeremy alluded to in his presentation, which is true for us. So many of our trails, which I'll say, so the Bureau of Forestry, we have, I think it's over 4,000 miles of trails, both motorized and hiking only and shared use trails. So it's quite an extensive trail system, and so much of it, as Jeremy pointed out, I think he used the word legacy trails, which is a really good word, which for us was a kind of historically used paths and haul roads and other administrative facilities that over time became incorporated into our trail system. And this is over the course of decades throughout the history of the agency. But yeah, we do have a systematic way of assessing those trails. first of all, our entire state forest is monitored on a 15-year cycle as part of our landscape exam process, and that's the ground truthing part of not only trail facilities but a number of other the forest management dimensions. And then we have standardized trail assessment protocols as part of that, if that helps to answer your question.
Great. I see we are at time, but I have 2 questions left in the chat. So for folks who are able to stick around for a few extra minutes, I will direct the next question to Jeremy. Do you have any great techniques for closing legacy trails?
Yeah, I think first is to plan on replacing that trail if it's getting use, if it's a high use trail, and a lot of times we'll see folks try and close them temporarily, they get reopened. And if that's the situation you're in, look at what type of experience it's providing or what access it's providing first, and put in your replacement in terms of a sustainably laid out and built trail. And then simultaneously, as soon as that's open, work to close the other. Some trails can be closed rather quickly with minimal inputs. Others require almost like landscape scale restoration, going in and moving a lot of earth and recontouring it, and then doing transplants and vegetation management to close that trail off.
Okay, and our final question for today. It seems with your research, you have lots of support about maintenance being, an issue for park trail sustainability, safety, and use. Are these statistics altering DCNR's position about whether they will allot grant funds to maintenance?
I would turn that question to somebody in charge of allocating grant funding. But I can say for the Bureau of Forestry, I mean, it's definitely a very large part of our internal discussion, just the really rapid upswing in recreational use. I would say very safely over the past decade, the past year during the COVID pandemic was a notable uptick and well documented from a monitoring standpoint, and it has certainly garnered the attention at the secretary's level. I can say that truthfully. As far as how that plays out with funding allocations, remains to be seen, but it's definitely at an elevated priority level. I can say that much.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to all of our speakers who joined us today for this session on sustainable systems. As a reminder, the next webinar, Funding and Economic Development, will be next Thursday, October 29th at 11 a.m. And we hope to see everyone back again then.
Great.
Great. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.